May 15, 1943, New Guinea. The war in the Pacific had just entered its 18th month, and the United States Army was losing soldiers to an enemy they could not see. 23 patrols, 14 weeks, 0 results. That was the brutal reality facing Allied command in the Finisterre Range. Japanese supply depots were feeding thousands of enemy troops across the Southwest Pacific. American intelligence knew these facilities existed. Radio intercepts confirmed it. Prisoner interrogations verified it. But no one could find them. Not aerial reconnaissance. Not signals intelligence. Not 24 ground missions led by West Point-trained officers. Then came a 24-year-old cattle rancher from Arizona named James Whitehorse. No combat experience. No special training. No rank worth mentioning. Just an Apache kid who learned to read dirt before he learned to read books. Within 72 hours, this quiet Native American sergeant would expose a hidden Japanese base containing 97 enemy soldiers, enough ammunition to supply a regiment for 6 months, and intelligence documents that would shorten the New Guinea campaign by weeks. Military historians would later estimate his discovery saved hundreds of Allied lives. All because he noticed something wrong with a single footprint. Here is the crazy part. 5 trained American soldiers walked right past that footprint. They saw nothing, just another mark in the mud. Whitehorse saw deception. He saw a signature of lies written in the earth itself, a technique so clever it had fooled every Allied patrol for 4 months straight. What exactly did this Apache rancher see? Why did his commanding officer think his theory was completely insane? And how did ancient tracking wisdom defeat modern military camouflage? The answer begins with understanding just how badly things had gone wrong in the jungles of New Guinea. By early 1943, the Pacific War had reached a turning point. America was finally pushing back. Guadalcanal was secure after 6 months of hell. MacArthur was planning his island-hopping campaign toward Tokyo. Victory seemed possible for the first time since Pearl Harbor. But between Allied positions and Japan lay thousands of miles of enemy territory. And the worst of it was New Guinea. The island was a death trap. Mountains over 13,000 feet covered in triple canopy jungle. Rivers that changed course without warning. Disease that killed more men than bullets. Malaria took soldiers by the hundreds. Dysentery crippled entire battalions. Tropical infections rotted flesh faster than medics could treat it. The Japanese had turned this nightmare into a weapon. Unable to match American firepower in open combat, they went underground. Literally. Hidden supply depots fed guerrilla operations across the highlands. Concealed bunkers housed artillery that appeared from nowhere, fired devastating barrages, then vanished. Communication centers coordinated enemy movements from locations no Allied soldier had ever seen. The cost was measured in blood. Every week these hidden bases operated meant more ambushed convoys, more dead Americans, more failed operations. Intelligence estimated that a single major depot in the Finisterre Range was enabling attacks that killed or wounded dozens of Allied personnel monthly. Finding these facilities was not just tactical. It was survival. Captain Richard Morrison understood this with painful clarity. West Point class of 1938. Combat veteran from North Africa. He had volunteered for Pacific duty believing his training would prove decisive against a technologically inferior enemy. The jungle broke that belief in pieces. Morrison had personally led 9 patrols into the Finisterre Range. 9 times he returned with exhausted men and nothing else. He had lost 3 soldiers to enemy ambushes, 2 to disease, 1 to a fall down a ravine so deep they never recovered the body. His superiors were losing patience. His men were losing faith. The Japanese were not just hiding, they were mocking him. Every trail led nowhere. Every promising lead dissolved into dead ends. It was like chasing ghosts through green hell. Morrison needed a miracle. What he got was a skinny Apache sergeant who looked more like a ranch hand than a soldier. James Whitehorse arrived at base camp on a rain-soaked morning in early May. He stepped off the supply aircraft carrying nothing but a standard issue pack and a quietness that made other soldiers uncomfortable. His service record was unremarkable. Average training scores, qualified but not exceptional marksmanship. Nothing that suggested he would accomplish what dozens of better-trained men could not. But paperwork cannot measure what a grandfather teaches. Whitehorse's education began at age 5 on the Fort Apache Reservation in Arizona. His grandfather, a man the Apache called "he who sees what others miss," took the boy walking across the rangeland every morning before dawn. Not hiking, not exercising, reading. The old man taught young James that the earth speaks to those who listen. Every track tells a story. Every bent blade of grass reveals direction and speed. Every displaced pebble shows weight and intention. The land remembers everything that crosses it. You just have to learn its language. For 15 years, Whitehorse studied that language. He tracked lost cattle across miles of desert where other ranchers saw only emptiness. He predicted predator movements days in advance. He found water sources that had been dry for generations by reading patterns in vegetation that no white rancher would ever notice. Word spread through the reservation, then beyond. Eventually, it reached military recruiters looking for Native Americans with traditional skills. The Army wanted trackers for Pacific operations. They found one who had been training his entire life without knowing why. Morrison briefed his new sergeant with professional efficiency and private skepticism. Arizona desert tracking in New Guinea jungle. Different vegetation. Different soil. Different everything. The captain gave Whitehorse about a 10% chance of being useful. The Apache listened without expression. He asked few questions. When Morrison finished, Whitehorse made an unusual request. He wanted every scrap of documentation from previous patrols. Not the official reports, the raw notes, hand-drawn maps, casual observations soldiers considered too minor to include formally. Morrison thought it was a waste of time. He authorized it anyway. What did he have to lose? It took 2 days to gather the materials. Whitehorse spent those days walking the base camp perimeter, watching, learning. He observed how jungle soil registered different types of movement, how rain affected tracks, how vegetation recovered from disturbance. He was translating his grandfather's teachings into a new dialect. When the patrol records arrived, something changed in the Apache's eyes. He studied them for 18 hours straight. No sleep, barely any water. Just page after page of notes and maps spread across a wooden table in the supply tent. Morrison found him at dawn surrounded by scattered papers, his finger tracing invisible lines between patrol routes. Whitehorse had found the pattern. Every patrol followed trails that seemed to lead toward potential hiding locations, but every trail eventually curved away. Subtly, naturally. So gradually that soldiers walking them never noticed they were being LED. Morrison dismissed it. Jungle trails curve around obstacles, around elevation changes. There is nothing suspicious about that. Whitehorse disagreed. Someone had manufactured these trails, created them to look natural while channeling movement away from something hidden deeper in the mountains. The deception was so good, it had fooled every patrol for 4 months. Morrison thought the theory was insane. Trails had been scouted by experienced men who found nothing unusual. What made this Apache think he could see what trained soldiers missed? Whitehorse answered simply. His grandfather had taught him that deception is the most honest form of communication. It tells you exactly what someone wants to hide by showing you how hard they work to hide it. The Japanese were not just concealing a base, they were screaming its location through the very effort of their lies. Morrison stared at the young sergeant for a long moment. The theory sounded crazy, but crazy was all he had left. 23 failed patrols, 3 dead soldiers. A supply depot that intelligence swore existed somewhere in those mountains. He authorized 1 more patrol, May 15, 1943, 7 men, led by an Apache cattle rancher who claimed he could read Japanese lies in the dirt. They departed at 0600 hours. 6 hours later, everything changed. The patrol had covered approximately 4 miles into the interior when Whitehorse stopped suddenly on a muddy trail. He dropped to one knee, his fingertips hovering inches above a shallow depression in the wet earth. To the 5 soldiers behind him, it looked like nothing. A natural indent. Maybe an animal track filled with rain. Private Tommy Chen, the unit's Chinese-American interpreter, asked what the tracker had found. He had grown up on concrete streets in San Francisco. Tracking meant following streetcars. Whitehorse did not answer immediately. His eyes moved across the forest floor in patterns that seemed random. 2 minutes passed. 3. The other soldiers shifted nervously. They had seen this before on other patrols. Someone thinks they found something. Turns out to be nothing. They trudged back to base with sore feet and empty hands. Then Whitehorse stood, and he smiled. Someone walked backward through here, he announced, deliberately placing their feet in existing footprints to hide their passage. But they made a mistake. Morrison felt his pulse spike. What kind of mistake? Whitehorse explained. When a person walks normally, heel strikes first, creates the deepest impression at the back of the print. When someone walks backward, trying to step in existing tracks, weight distribution reverses. Toe becomes deepest because that is where the walker looks to aim their step. This print showed toe first weight, but it pointed in a direction suggesting travel away from the interior mountains. Chen frowned. Could it not simply be an unusual walking pattern? Physical abnormality, Whitehorse answered by walking 30 yards down the trail. He pointed out 6 more prints. All showed identical characteristics. All showed reversed pressure. No one walks naturally this way, he said. It was deliberate, careful, systematic. Someone was working very hard to make it appear that traffic flowed away from the mountains rather than toward them. The implications hit Morrison like artillery. If the Apache was right, then every patrol that followed these trails had been LED away from the target. Not by accident, by design. The Japanese had created an elaborate deception system that actively misdirected anyone searching for their hidden base. For 4 months, American soldiers had been following trails the enemy wanted them to follow. Morrison radioed battalion headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Hayes received the report with cautious interest. Hayes was a North Africa veteran who had learned to trust unusual intelligence sources. He authorized Morrison to follow the backward tracks, but insisted on reinforcements. An additional squad. A radio team. If this lead was real, he wanted enough men to exploit it. While waiting for reinforcements, Whitehorse continued his analysis. What he found next troubled him deeply. Vegetation along the trail showed signs of careful management. Certain plants had been trimmed to appear natural while actually creating clear sight lines. The pattern was too regular, too methodical. Someone was maintaining this trail to look abandoned while using it regularly. The Japanese were not just hiding. They were performing an elaborate theatrical production with the jungle as their stage. Reinforcements arrived 3 hours later. The expanded patrol moved inland with Whitehorse leading. The Apache no longer followed individual footprints. He followed the pattern of deception itself. A tree cut and repositioned to block a path. Rocks placed to make a route seem impassable. Vegetation growing in formations just slightly too perfect to be random. Each sign pointed deeper into the mountains, toward something the enemy desperately wanted to remain hidden. By nightfall, the patrol had covered 8 miles into territory no Allied soldier had ever penetrated. They made camp in a small clearing that Whitehorse declared safe because it showed none of the careful management he had observed elsewhere. Morrison could not sleep. The Apache's theory was proving terrifyingly accurate. Every mile revealed new evidence of systematic deception. The Japanese had invested months of effort into creating false trails and managed vegetation. Whatever they were protecting had to be significant. But significant, how a supply depot could justify considerable effort. But this level of deception suggested something more. Something the enemy considered worth any cost to conceal. Dawn brought rain and new discoveries. The patrol found their first physical evidence shortly after noon. Private Michael O'Brien, a former construction worker from Boston, literally stumbled over it. A piece of metal half buried in mud. Part of a Japanese ammunition crate. Sergeant Robert Tanaka, a Japanese-American translator attached from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, examined the markings. His face went pale. 75mm shells, he reported. Ammunition for Type 88 anti-aircraft guns. Morrison felt ice in his stomach. Intelligence had reported no Japanese anti-aircraft positions in this region. If they were bringing in that kind of ammunition, they were protecting something that warranted defense against Allied aircraft. Something big. The patrol pressed deeper into the mountains. On the afternoon of the third day, they found the garden, a small clearing where edible plants grew in neat rows. But someone had gone to elaborate lengths to make it appear wild. Vines woven through crops, dead leaves scattered deliberately, weeds growing in carefully planned locations. Only close examination revealed the artificial nature of the chaos. Morrison radioed Hayes. The battalion commander's response was immediate. The presence of a concealed garden meant they were very close to an occupied position, possibly within a few hundred yards. 2 more platoons were en route, but they were 6 hours away through difficult terrain. Proceed with extreme caution, Hayes ordered. Locate the entrance. Do not attempt entry until overwhelming force is available. The patrol moved forward with weapons ready, every sense heightened, hearts pounding, fingers on triggers. They were close now. Close to something the Japanese had spent months hiding. Something protected by anti-aircraft guns and deception systems and managed vegetation extending for miles. Then, Sergeant William Drake stepped on what appeared to be solid ground. The earth gave way beneath him. He plunged 8 feet into a concealed pit lined with sharpened bamboo stakes. His scream echoed through the jungle before cutting short as he hit bottom. The patrol froze, weapons pointed in every direction, expecting ambush, expecting gunfire, expecting death. Nothing came. Drake was pulled from the pit with severe lacerations, serious, but not fatal. As medics worked on him, Whitehorse examined the trap with intense focus. Then he announced something that seemed impossible. This pit was old, 3 months or more. The bamboo showed weathering inconsistent with active defensive positions. Someone had dug this trap and then largely forgotten about it. Morrison asked what that meant. Whitehorse's answer changed everything. Whatever they were protecting had been here long enough that the outer defenses had become neglected. The Japanese were not expecting enemy patrols this deep. They had grown comfortable. They had grown careless. And that carelessness was about to cost them everything. But the patrol still faced a critical problem. They had found evidence of a massive hidden facility. Anti-aircraft ammunition, concealed gardens, elaborate deception systems, defensive traps. What they had not found was the entrance. Somewhere beneath their feet, possibly within 100 yards, lay a Japanese base large enough to require anti-aircraft protection and month of supply cultivation. But the jungle revealed nothing. No doors, no tunnels, no visible access points. The Japanese had hidden their facility so well that even standing on top of it, American soldiers could not find a way in. Morrison made a decision that would prove crucial. He split the patrol. He would take Drake and 3 soldiers back to meet reinforcements. Whitehorse would continue forward with a 5-man reconnaissance team moving slowly, reporting every 30 minutes. Find the entrance, Morrison ordered. But do not engage, just find it. Whitehorse nodded. He had tracked lost cattle across Arizona for 15 years. He had found water sources that had been hidden for generations. He had read deception in footprints that trained soldiers walked past without seeing. Now he would find a door that the Japanese believed was invisible. What he discovered would exceed anyone's expectations. Not just a supply depot, not just a hidden base, but an underground complex so sophisticated that intelligence officers would later call it one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the Pacific War. In Part 2, We will follow Whitehorse's reconnaissance team as they locate ventilation shafts rising from the jungle floor. Evidence of something massive hidden beneath the mountains. We will witness the moment when an artificial hillside opens to reveal a tunnel large enough for trucks. And we will learn the shocking truth about what the Japanese had built while American patrols walked past for 4 months straight. The question that haunted Morrison as he watched his Apache tracker disappear into the green darkness was simple but terrifying. If the Japanese had gone to these lengths to hide their facility, what exactly were they protecting? He was about to find out. A cattle rancher from Arizona, a theory everyone called insane, and a footprint that 5 trained soldiers walked past without seeing. In Part 1, Sergeant James Whitehorse proved that the Japanese had created an elaborate deception system in the Finisterre Range. Backward footprints, managed vegetation, false trails designed to lead Allied patrols away from their hidden base. After 3 days of tracking, his reconnaissance team had found anti-aircraft ammunition, concealed gardens, and defensive traps. But they still had not found the entrance. Somewhere beneath their feet lay a facility important enough to justify months of deception. A facility the Japanese believed was invisible. Now Whitehorse faced an impossible task. Find a door that did not appear to exist. Find it before the enemy discovered his 5-man team. Find it with reinforcements still 6 hours away. The odds were against him. The jungle fought him at every step. And what waited inside that hidden base would shock even the intelligence officers who thought they had seen everything. This is where things got dangerous. The reconnaissance team moved through the jungle like ghosts. 5 men, minimal equipment, maximum caution. Whitehorse led them along routes that seemed to spiral around an invisible center. He was not searching randomly. He was reading the landscape the way his grandfather had taught him, looking for the one thing that could not be hidden: air. Any underground facility large enough to house soldiers needed ventilation. Fresh air in, stale air out. The Japanese could camouflage doors. They could hide trails, but they could not stop air from moving. Private Michael O'Brien spotted it first. A slight shimmer above a cluster of rocks. Heat distortion. But the rocks were in shade. There was no reason for heat to rise from cold stone. Whitehorse approached carefully. His fingers traced the rock surfaces. Real stone. Not camouflage, but arranged around something metal. A pipe extending 6 inches above ground level, covered with a cap designed to look like natural rock. A ventilation shaft. The team spread out. Within 20 minutes they located 4 more shafts, all expertly concealed, all positioned to disperse airflow across a wide area. The implications hit Whitehorse immediately. Whatever lay beneath required massive ventilation. This was not a small supply cache. This was something far larger than anyone had anticipated. He radioed Captain Morrison. The response came back charged with excitement. Reinforcements were 2 hours out. Battalion Commander Hayes had authorized a full company strength probe with artillery support on standby. Find the entrance, Morrison ordered. Do not engage until we arrive. The search consumed the remaining daylight. The team worked outward from the ventilation shafts in careful spirals. They found nothing. No doors, no tunnels, no visible access points. The Japanese had hidden their entrance so completely that even knowing a base existed, American soldiers could not locate how to get inside. Darkness fell. The team established an observation post on high ground overlooking the ventilation shaft concentration. They would wait. Watch. Hope that morning revealed what daylight had hidden. It did. But not in any way they expected. Corporal David Sullivan noticed it first. A hillside approximately 200 yards from their position. Something about the vegetation seemed wrong. A slight movement that might have been wind, except the air was completely still. Sullivan pointed it out to Whitehorse. The Apache studied the hillside through binoculars for 10 full minutes. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching awe. That entire hillside is artificial, he announced. A massive camouflage structure, not just covering the entrance. It is the entrance. The Japanese had built something that functioned as both door and disguise simultaneously. An engineering achievement that bordered on genius. The hillside did not hide a tunnel. The hillside was a tunnel. A door so large and so perfectly camouflaged that it appeared to be natural terrain. Morrison and the main force arrived at 0200 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes accompanied them personally. 2 intelligence officers had flown in from Port Moresby specifically for this operation. Everyone maintained strict radio silence. They surrounded the artificial hillside. They waited for dawn. What happened next changed everything the Army understood about Japanese capabilities. At 0617 hours, the hillside opened. It happened so smoothly that observers needed several seconds to process what they were seeing. A section of slope that appeared to be solid earth covered in living vegetation simply swung outward on concealed hinges. The movement was nearly silent. The camouflage was nearly perfect. If the patrol had not been watching that exact spot, they would have missed it entirely. A tunnel entrance appeared, large enough to drive a truck through. 2 Japanese soldiers emerged. They stretched in the morning air. They began what appeared to be a routine perimeter check. Their body language showed no concern, no alertness. They had performed this routine hundreds of times without incident. They had no idea that over 60 American soldiers were watching from the jungle. Hayes made a critical decision. He wanted more information before launching an assault. How many personnel occupied the facility? What kind of supplies did they possess? What defensive positions protected the entrance? Throughout the morning, they observed 17 different soldiers entering or leaving the tunnel. All appeared relaxed. None showed any indication they suspected enemy presence. The Japanese had grown comfortable in their invisible fortress. That comfort was about to cost them everything. At 1000 hours, something unexpected emerged from the tunnel. Civilians. 14 men and women of various ages. All thin. All exhausted. They carried bundles of vegetation and roots. They walked into the jungle under loose supervision from 3 armed guards. Sergeant Robert Tanaka studied them through binoculars. His face went pale. Local villagers, he reported, impressed into forced labor, probably maintaining the concealed gardens. Hayes swore under his breath. Civilian presence complicated everything. A direct assault risked killing innocent people. It might also cause the Japanese to destroy whatever intelligence materials the facility contained before capture. He made a new decision. Wait for the civilians to return. Seal the entrance. Force surrender. The waiting stretched through the afternoon. The civilian workers returned at dusk, carrying their harvest back into the tunnel. The massive camouflage door closed behind them. The hillside became invisible again. Hayes gave the order. Move into assault positions. Under cover of darkness, 3 infantry platoons surrounded the entrance. Combat engineers prepared demolition charges. Artillery forward observers established communications with gun batteries 5 miles east. Everything was ready. At 500 hours, Hayes broadcast a surrender demand in Japanese through loudspeakers positioned during the night. The facility is surrounded by overwhelming force. Resistance is futile. Civilians will not be harmed. Surrender immediately. The message repeated every 2 minutes. For 15 minutes, nothing happened. The jungle remained silent. The artificial hillside remained closed. Then the door opened. A single Japanese officer emerged, hands raised above his head. He identified himself through Tanaka as Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, commander of the supply depot. He wished to negotiate terms for civilian safety before discussing military surrender. The negotiation took 3 hours. Yamamoto demanded immediate release of the 14 civilians with safe passage to their village. Hayes agreed, provided Yamamoto ordered his soldiers to disarm and exit in orderly fashion. The lieutenant accepted. What emerged from that tunnel over the next 2 hours astonished everyone present. Not 30 soldiers, not 40. 97 military personnel exited the facility: engineers, supply clerks, communications specialists, a security detachment. They had operated underground for nearly 7 months, constructing, maintaining, coordinating, all without detection. But the true revelation came when Allied soldiers entered the facility itself. The underground complex extended more than 400 feet into the mountain. Multiple chambers, storage areas carved from living rock. They found ammunition stockpiles sufficient to supply a full regiment for 6 months. Medical supplies, food stores, a complete radio communication center with equipment capable of reaching the Philippines. And in a small office deep within the complex, intelligence officers discovered something that made the entire operation worthwhile. Maps, detailed maps showing locations of 6 other hidden facilities throughout New Guinea. Yamamoto's personal journal revealed even more. He had documented the construction process meticulously. The backward footprint technique had been taught to him by a sergeant who served in China. He had considered it foolproof. He had noted that 17 Allied patrols had passed within a quarter mile of the facility entrance over 4 months without detecting anything. He had not anticipated encountering someone trained to read deception itself. The intelligence windfall was staggering. Within 3 weeks, Allied forces located and destroyed 4 of the 6 additional facilities identified in Yamamoto's maps. Military historians would later estimate that the single discovery shortened the New Guinea campaign by several weeks. The ammunition and supplies captured prevented enemy operations that would have cost dozens of Allied lives. But the impact extended far beyond immediate tactical gains. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes submitted a classified report to Pacific Command. His argument was revolutionary. The military needed to fundamentally rethink how it recruited and utilized soldiers with specialized cultural knowledge. An Apache sergeant had accomplished, through traditional wisdom, what technology and conventional tactics had failed to achieve for 4 months. The report sparked intense debate at the highest levels of military leadership. Some commanders embraced the concept immediately. If Native American tracking skills could expose hidden Japanese bases, what other traditional knowledge might prove valuable? What expertise existed in communities the military had never thought to consult? Others resisted. The Army had procedures, training programs, established doctrine developed over decades. You could not simply recruit soldiers based on skills learned from their grandfathers. That was not how modern warfare worked. The debate might have continued indefinitely, but events in the Pacific would not wait for bureaucratic resolution. Word of Whitehorse's discovery spread through military channels. Other commanders began requesting Native American trackers for their own operations. Within 6 months, the Army had recruited over 40 soldiers specifically for their traditional tracking abilities. Navajo, Cherokee, Sioux, Apache. Men whose ancestors had read the land for generations now applied that knowledge against a technologically sophisticated enemy. The results exceeded all expectations. In the Philippines, a Navajo tracker identified a concealed Japanese artillery position that had shelled American forces for 3 weeks without detection. His observation of disturbed vegetation patterns led to the position's destruction within 48 hours of his arrival. On Okinawa, a Cherokee soldier noticed something wrong with a hillside that appeared completely natural. His insistence that the terrain had been artificially modified led to the discovery of a tunnel network housing over 200 enemy soldiers. Each success validated Hayes's report. Each success challenged assumptions about what constituted military expertise. Each success saved American lives. But success brought its own complications. James Whitehorse received the Silver Star for his role in discovering Yamamoto's facility. The ceremony made him visibly uncomfortable. He was not a man who sought recognition. He had simply applied what his grandfather taught him. The attention felt wrong. A war correspondent requested an interview. Whitehorse agreed reluctantly. When asked to explain his tracking methodology, he struggled to articulate what was largely instinct and tradition. His grandfather had taught him that the earth speaks to those who listen. How do you explain listening to people who have never been taught to hear? He finally said something that would be quoted in military publications for years afterward. Deception is the most honest form of communication. It tells you exactly what someone wants to hide through the very effort of hiding it. The Japanese worked hard to make their trails lead away from their base. That effort was the trail. All I did was follow it. The quote captured something profound about intelligence gathering. The enemy reveals themselves not just through mistakes, but through successes. Perfect camouflage requires perfect effort, and perfect effort leaves perfect evidence for those trained to recognize it. Military doctrine began changing. Tracking and deception analysis became components of patrol training. The assumption that modern warfare had made traditional skills obsolete was challenged and ultimately revised. Commanders learned to value diverse expertise. But as American forces applied these lessons across the Pacific, something else was happening. The Japanese were learning too. Reports began filtering back through intelligence channels. Enemy forces were modifying their concealment techniques. Patrols were encountering new deception methods. The backward footprint technique that Whitehorse had identified was being abandoned in favor of more sophisticated approaches. Someone had talked, or documents had been captured, or the Japanese had simply observed that their methods were no longer working and adapted accordingly. The invisible war was evolving, and in a command bunker somewhere in the Philippines, Japanese intelligence officers were studying reports of their own. Reports about Native American soldiers with seemingly supernatural tracking abilities. Reports about facilities discovered after months of successful concealment. Reports about techniques that had worked for years suddenly failing. They were developing countermeasures. The question was no longer whether traditional tracking skills could defeat Japanese camouflage. Whitehorse had proven they could. The question now was whether those skills could stay ahead of an enemy that was actively adapting to neutralize them. The first test of that question came on a jungle island called Bougainville. A patrol led by a Sioux tracker named Thomas Crow Feather encountered something none of them expected, a deception designed specifically to fool trackers. The Japanese had studied how their concealment had failed. They had analyzed the patterns that Native American soldiers looked for, and they had created new techniques intended to lead those soldiers into ambushes rather than toward hidden facilities. The hunters were about to become the hunted. In Part 3, we will follow Crow Feather's patrol into a trap that killed 3 American soldiers and nearly ended the entire tracking program. We will see how the Japanese developed counter-tracking methods that exploited the very skills Native American soldiers had been recruited for. And we will witness the desperate innovation that allowed Whitehorse and others to stay one step ahead of an enemy that was learning from every encounter. The discovery of Yamamoto's base had proven that traditional wisdom could defeat modern camouflage. But the Japanese were not fools. They adapted. They evolved. They turned American success into American vulnerability. The War of Deception was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and James Whitehorse would find himself facing an enemy who had learned to read his methods the same way he had learned to read theirs. The question was simple. In a war between trackers, who would see the other first? The answer would determine whether the tracking program survived or died in the jungles of the Pacific. An Apache cattle rancher noticed a single wrong footprint. That observation exposed a hidden Japanese base containing 97 soldiers and intelligence that shortened the New Guinea campaign by weeks. The discovery proved that traditional tracking wisdom could defeat modern military camouflage. The Army listened. Within 6 months, over 40 Native American soldiers were recruited for their ancestral skills. Navajo, Cherokee, Sioux, Apache. Each brought generations of knowledge to the Pacific battlefield. Each found success against Japanese concealment that had frustrated conventional forces for months. But the Japanese were not fools. They studied their failures. They analyzed how their deceptions had been exposed, and they developed something terrifying. Counter-tracking techniques designed specifically to exploit the skills Native American soldiers had been recruited for. On Bougainville Island, a Sioux tracker named Thomas Crow Feather was about to walk into a trap that would kill 3 American soldiers and nearly destroy the entire tracking program. The hunters were about to become the hunted. And this was no longer an experiment. This was war. Japanese intelligence had been monitoring the situation since Yamamoto's facility fell in New Guinea. Reports filtered back through their network describing American soldiers with seemingly supernatural abilities to read terrain. Soldiers who could detect concealed positions that had fooled patrols for months. Soldiers whose skills defied conventional military explanation. Colonel Hiroshi Taniguchi, commanding Japanese intelligence operations in the Solomon Islands, took these reports seriously. A graduate of the Imperial Army Academy with extensive experience in China, Taniguchi understood that underestimating enemy capabilities led to defeat. He requested all available information about Native American tracking techniques. What he discovered alarmed him. The Americans were not using technology. They were using tradition. Skills passed down through generations. Knowledge that existed in no manual, no training program, no document that could be captured or copied. The Japanese could not steal this capability. They could not replicate it. They had to neutralize it. Taniguchi assembled a team of specialists, engineers, camouflage experts, soldiers who had survived encounters with Native American trackers and could describe what those trackers looked for. For 3 weeks, they studied the problem with methodical precision. The solution they developed was elegant and deadly. If Native American trackers looked for signs of deception, then create deceptions that lead to ambushes rather than hidden facilities. If they followed backward footprints, create backward footprints that led into kill zones. If they identified manage vegetation in patterns that funneled pursuers into crossfire positions. Turn American strengths into American vulnerabilities. The first test came on November 12, 1943, Bougainville Island. Thomas Crow Feather led a 12-man patrol into jungle that intelligence believed contained a Japanese observation post. Crow Feather was experienced. He had participated in 3 successful operations using tracking techniques. He knew what to look for. That knowledge nearly killed him. Within 2 hours, Crow Feather identified familiar signs. Backward footprints. Managed vegetation. Trails designed to misdirect. He followed them with growing confidence. His patrol moved deeper into the jungle. Every sign confirmed they were approaching a hidden position. They were approaching a trap. The ambush erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. Machine gun fire. Grenades. Mortar rounds crashing through the canopy. 3 American soldiers died in the first 15 seconds. 4 more were wounded. Crow Feather took shrapnel in his left shoulder, but managed to organize a fighting retreat. The patrol escaped. Barely. But the damage extended far beyond 7 casualties. Word spread through military channels within hours. Native American tracking techniques had failed. Worse than failed. They had been used against American forces. A Japanese trap had exploited the very skills the Army had recruited these soldiers to provide. The backlash was immediate and severe. Some commanders demanded immediate suspension of the tracking program. The risks outweighed the benefits. Native American soldiers were getting their own people killed by following trails the enemy had deliberately created. Better to rely on conventional reconnaissance than skills that could be manipulated. Others defended the program. One failure did not negate dozens of successes. The Japanese had adapted because the tracking program was working. You do not develop countermeasures against something that poses no threat. The solution was counter-adaptation, not abandonment. The debate reached Pacific Command. General Douglas MacArthur himself reviewed the situation. The tracking program had contributed to significant intelligence victories, but Bougainville raised serious questions. Were Native American soldiers assets or liabilities? Was traditional wisdom adaptable enough to survive against an enemy actively working to defeat it? MacArthur made a decision that would prove crucial. The program would continue. But it needed to evolve. Someone had to figure out how to distinguish genuine Japanese deceptions from traps designed to exploit tracker skills. That someone was James Whitehorse. Whitehorse received orders to report to Bougainville within 48 hours of the ambush. He arrived to find a demoralized unit and a wounded Crow Feather who blamed himself for the deaths of 3 soldiers. The Sioux tracker explained what had happened. Every sign he followed had been correct. Backward footprints, managed vegetation, classic Japanese concealment patterns. Whitehorse listened without interrupting. Then he asked a question that changed everything. Did anything feel wrong? Crow. Feather paused. He thought back through the patrol. The signs had been textbook. Perfect examples of Japanese deception. Almost too perfect. There had been something bothering him, something he had dismissed as nervousness. The trail had been too easy to follow. Whitehorse nodded. His grandfather had taught him that genuine deception serves a purpose. The Japanese concealed their bases because they needed those bases to remain hidden. Every element of their deception supported that goal. But a trap serves a different purpose. It needs to be found. It needs to attract pursuers into kill zones. A real hidden base tries to remain invisible. A trap wants to be discovered. The difference was subtle but critical. Genuine Japanese concealment was designed to fool trackers. Trap trails were designed to attract them. The signs were too obvious, too perfectly placed, too easy to follow. Real deception required effort to detect. Traps practically announced themselves to anyone trained to look. Whitehorse spent 2 weeks on Bougainville developing new protocols. He worked with Crow Feather and 3 other Native American trackers to identify distinguishing characteristics between genuine concealment and deliberate attraction. They created a checklist, warning signs that indicated a trail might be bait rather than evidence. The training was tested on December 3, 1943. A patrol encountered a trail showing classic deception indicators. The tracker, a Cherokee named William Redbird, stopped the advance and reported his suspicion that the trail was a trap. The patrol commander called for artillery support. Shells saturated the area ahead of their position. Secondary explosions confirmed the presence of concealed ammunition. The Japanese had prepared an ambush position. American artillery destroyed it before a single soldier entered the kill zone. The counter-adaptation was working, but the real test came 2 weeks later. December 17, 1943. Operation Cartwheel was advancing through the Solomon Islands. Intelligence identified a critical Japanese communications facility on Bougainville that was coordinating enemy naval movements across the region. Destroying it would blind Japanese forces to American ship positions for weeks. The problem was finding it. Aerial reconnaissance showed nothing. Conventional patrols found nothing. The facility was hidden using the same techniques that had protected Yamamoto's base in New Guinea. James Whitehorse led the mission personally. His patrol departed at 0430 hours. 14 men, experienced soldiers, 3 Native American trackers including Crow Feather now recovered from his wounds and determined to redeem himself. They moved into jungle that had already claimed dozens of American lives. Whitehorse found the first signs within 3 hours. Backward footprints, managed vegetation, classic deception patterns. But something was wrong. The trail was too obvious, too perfectly placed. His instincts screamed, trap. He stopped the patrol, studied the signs, applied the protocols he had developed over the previous weeks. The backward footprints were recent, too recent. Genuine concealment trails showed weathering from repeated use over months. These appeared fresh, planted. Whitehorse made a decision. Ignore the obvious trail. Look for something else. Something the Japanese did not want found. The patrol spent 4 hours searching the surrounding area. Frustration mounted. Some soldiers questioned the Apache's judgment. They had clear signs pointing in a specific direction. Why were they wasting time looking elsewhere? Then Crow Feather found it. Not a trail. An absence of trail. a section of jungle floor that showed no disturbance whatsoever. No footprints, no bent vegetation, no displaced stones. Nothing. In an area where animals and weather should have left constant marks, there was nothing. Someone had erased all traces of passage, completely, methodically, perfectly. That perfection was the signature. The Japanese had been so careful to hide this route that they had hidden it too well. Natural jungle always shows some disturbance. This section showed none. The very absence of evidence was evidence. Whitehorse led the patrol along the erased route. They moved slowly, carefully, looking for the next section of impossible cleanliness. Within 2 hours, they found ventilation shafts. Within 3, they located the communications facility entrance. The assault began at 1340 hours. 14 Americans against an estimated 30 Japanese. The facility was defended. Machine gun positions. Prepared fighting positions. But the defenders were oriented toward the trap trail. They expected attack from a different direction. Whitehorse's patrol hit them from their blind side. The fight lasted 23 minutes. Grenades. Small arms fire. Close combat in jungle so thick you could not see 10 feet. American soldiers moved through positions the Japanese had not expected to defend. Whitehorse killed 2 enemy soldiers personally. Crowfeather accounted for 3 more. Private Chen, the interpreter from San Francisco, who had been present at the original discovery in New Guinea, captured a Japanese officer attempting to destroy communications equipment. When the shooting stopped, 22 Japanese soldiers were dead. 6 were captured. 2 Americans had been wounded, neither seriously. The communications facility was intact, its codebooks and frequency logs preserved for intelligence analysis. The impact was immediate. Intelligence officers analyzed captured materials for 72 hours straight. They identified Japanese naval communication protocols across the entire Solomon Islands region. American submarines used this information to intercept 3 enemy supply convoys over the following month. Over 12,000 tons of supplies intended for Japanese garrisons never arrived. But the strategic implications extended further. The Bougainville Communications Facility had been coordinating information that allowed Japanese forces to evade American naval patrols. With it destroyed and its codes compromised, enemy ship movements became predictable. American forces sank or damaged 14 Japanese vessels in the 6 weeks following the raid. Conservative estimates suggested over 2,000 enemy sailors were killed. All because an Apache tracker learned to read the absence of evidence as clearly as its presence. Word of the mission spread through military channels. The tracking program that had nearly been canceled after the ambush was now being cited as essential to Pacific operations. Commanders who had demanded its suspension were now requesting Native American trackers for their own units. The Japanese responded with increasing desperation. Colonel Taniguchi developed more sophisticated trap techniques, but each adaptation was countered by evolving tracker protocols. The Americans were learning faster than the Japanese could adjust. By February 1944, the tracking program had contributed to the discovery of 11 hidden Japanese facilities across the Pacific. Over 400 enemy soldiers had been killed or captured. Intelligence materials seized in these operations provided information that influenced dozens of subsequent missions. Military doctrine officially changed. Tracking and deception analysis became standard components of jungle warfare training. The assumption that traditional skills had no place in modern combat was permanently discredited. Native American soldiers received recognition that had been denied to indigenous peoples throughout American military history. James Whitehorse received a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. The cattle rancher from Arizona was now an officer. More importantly, he was recognized as the founder of a tactical approach that saved countless American lives. Sergeant Robert Tanaka, the Japanese-American translator, who had been present at both the original discovery and the Bougainville mission, wrote a letter to his parents in the internment camp where they remained imprisoned. He described fighting alongside Native Americans against an enemy that shared his ethnic heritage, defending a country that had imprisoned his family. The complexity of his situation defied simple explanation, but he was proud of what they had accomplished together. Thomas Crow Feather received the Bronze Star for his role in the communications facility assault. The Sioux tracker who had blamed himself for the deaths of 3 soldiers had redeemed himself in the most meaningful way possible. He had learned from failure and helped develop techniques that prevented future failures. The tracking program continued expanding through 1944 and into 1945. Native American soldiers served across the Pacific from the Philippines to Okinawa. Each brought unique skills shaped by their specific tribal traditions. Each contributed to an approach that combined ancestral wisdom with modern military requirements. The Japanese never fully solved the tracking problem. Their counter techniques became increasingly sophisticated, but American adaptation stayed ahead. The invisible war between concealment and detection continued until Japan's surrender with Native American trackers maintaining a consistent advantage. Total impact estimates varied, but military historians generally agreed on the scale. The tracking program directly contributed to operations that killed or captured over 2,000 enemy soldiers. Intelligence gathered from discovered facilities influenced missions affecting tens of thousands more. The program shortened Pacific campaigns by weeks or months in multiple theaters. Conservative calculations suggested that tracking techniques developed from an Apache cattle rancher's observation of a single footprint saved between 500 and 1,000 American lives over the course of the war. All because James Whitehorse noticed something wrong in a mark on the ground that 5 trained soldiers walked past without seeing. But the war eventually ended. August 1945. Japan surrendered. Soldiers went home. The military began demobilizing, and a question emerged that few had considered during the desperate years of combat. What happens to the man who changed everything? James Whitehorse returned to Arizona, to the Fort Apache Reservation, to the cattle ranch where his grandfather had first taught him to read the earth. He had saved hundreds of lives. He had revolutionized military doctrine. He had proven that traditional wisdom could defeat modern camouflage. And almost nobody knew his name. The tracking program was classified. Operations remained secret. The Apache lieutenant who had accomplished what technology and conventional tactics could not was not mentioned in newspapers or celebrated in parades. He simply went home and resumed the life he had left behind. But his story was not over. Not quite. In Part 4, we will discover what happened to James Whitehorse in the decades after the war. We will learn how his techniques influenced military and law enforcement training for generations. We will meet the historians who eventually uncovered his contributions and the family members who preserved his memory. And we will understand why this cattle rancher from Arizona, this quiet man who read deception in footprints, represents something larger than military history. He represents the wisdom we almost forgot, the knowledge we nearly lost, the traditions we dismissed as primitive until they proved more effective than our most advanced technology. The war made James Whitehorse a hero. But what he did after the war made him a legend. That is the story almost no one knows. Until now, a single footprint. That is where this story began. An Apache cattle rancher named James Whitehorse noticed something wrong in a mark on the ground that 5 trained soldiers walked past without seeing. That observation exposed a hidden Japanese base. That discovery launched a tracking program that spread across the Pacific. That program contributed to operations killing or capturing over 2,000 enemy soldiers and saving an estimated 500 to 1,000 American lives. From a theory everyone called insane to a tactical revolution that changed military doctrine forever. But what happened to the man who started it all? What became of James Whitehorse when the guns fell silent and the soldiers went home? What legacy did he leave beyond classified reports and military statistics? This story has one final chapter, a chapter almost no one knows, a chapter that reveals something unexpected about heroism. memory, and the price of being ahead of your time. Because success sometimes comes with a cost that takes decades to understand. And James Whitehorse paid that cost in silence. August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over. Soldiers celebrated in streets from New York to San Francisco. Ticker tape parades honored returning heroes. Newspapers published names of decorated veterans. The nation embraced its warriors with gratitude and recognition. James Whitehorse was not among them. The tracking program remained classified. Operations he had led stayed secret. The Apache lieutenant, who had accomplished what technology and conventional tactics could not, was not mentioned in any newspaper. He received no parade, no public ceremony, no recognition beyond the military community that understood what he had done. He simply went home. The Fort Apache Reservation in Arizona had not changed much during his absence. The same dusty trails, the same cattle ranges, the same mountains where his grandfather had first taught him to read the earth. Whitehorse returned to the family ranch and resumed the life he had left behind 3 years earlier. His father had aged. His mother had worried. His younger siblings had grown. They welcomed him back with quiet joy, characteristic of Apache culture. No dramatic celebrations. No emotional displays. Just the steady comfort of family and land and tradition. Whitehorse rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would mention that he served in the Pacific, that he did some tracking work, that he was glad to be home. The details remained locked away, partly from classification requirements, partly from personal choice. He had seen friends die. He had killed enemy soldiers. He had carried responsibilities that weighed heavily on a man who never sought leadership. The transition was not easy. Many veterans struggled to readjust to civilian life. Whitehorse had additional challenges. He had been an officer, a leader, a man whose decisions affected dozens of lives. Now he was a ranch hand again, following cattle across terrain that seemed impossibly simple compared to New Guinea jungle. Some nights he could not sleep. The sounds of Arizona desert were too quiet after years of jungle noise. The absence of danger felt strange, almost uncomfortable. He had spent so long watching for threats that peace itself seemed threatening. His grandfather, now in his 80s, understood without being told. The old man had seen warriors return from other conflicts. He knew that some wounds did not show on the body. He spent long hours walking with his grandson across the rangeland, not speaking, just being present. It was Apache medicine for Apache pain. Slowly, Whitehorse healed. He married a woman named Sarah from a neighboring family in 1947. They had 3 children over the following decade. He built a life centered on family land and the traditions his grandfather had preserved through decades of cultural suppression. The war became a closed chapter, rarely opened, never fully shared. But the skills remained. Whitehorse continued tracking as he always had. Lost cattle, stray horses. Occasionally, he helped local law enforcement find missing persons in the vast Arizona wilderness. His reputation spread quietly through the region. People knew that if something was lost in the desert, James Whitehorse could find it. The military had not forgotten him either. In 1952, the Army contacted Whitehorse about consulting on a training program for Korean War operations. He declined. In 1965, they approached him again regarding Vietnam. He declined again. He had given enough. The war had taken years of his life and pieces of his peace. He would not give more. His fellow trackers from the Pacific scattered across America. Thomas Crowfeather returned to the Sioux Reservation in South Dakota and became a tribal elder. William Redbird went home to Cherokee Territory in Oklahoma and taught tracking to the next generation. Robert Tanaka, the Japanese-American translator, settled in Los Angeles and worked for reconciliation between former enemies until his death in 1987. They stayed in touch through letters and occasional reunions. Men who had shared experiences that no one else could understand. Men who had proven that traditional wisdom could defeat modern technology. Men whose contributions remained largely unknown outside military circles. But the legacy they created lived on in ways they could not have imagined. The tracking techniques developed during World War II did not disappear when the conflict ended. Military doctrine had been permanently altered. The assumption that traditional skills had no place in modern warfare had been definitively disproven. What began as an experiment with Native American soldiers became foundational knowledge for generations of military training. During the Korean War, tracking specialists trained using methods derived from Whitehorse's protocols operated throughout the peninsula. They identified Chinese infiltration routes through mountainous terrain that conventional reconnaissance missed. They detected supply trails hidden in forests that aerial photography could not penetrate. The lessons of New Guinea transferred directly to a new conflict on a different continent. Vietnam amplified the importance exponentially. The jungle warfare that had defined Pacific operations returned with devastating intensity. American forces faced an enemy that had perfected concealment over decades of resistance against French colonial forces. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army used tunnels, hidden bases, and camouflaged positions that echoed Japanese tactics from 20 years earlier. Military planners turned to tracking doctrine developed during World War II. They trained specialized units in deception analysis and terrain reading. They recruited soldiers from backgrounds that emphasized observation skills. The long-range reconnaissance patrols that operated deep in Vietnamese jungle owed their methodology directly to techniques pioneered by Native American trackers in the Pacific. Statistics from Vietnam validated the approach. Units trained in advanced tracking techniques reported significantly higher success rates in locating enemy positions. Ambush casualties decreased when patrols could identify trap indicators before entering kill zones. The invisible war between concealment and detection continued, with American forces maintaining advantages built on foundations laid by James Whitehorse and his fellow trackers. The influence extended beyond American military. Allied nations studied the tracking program and incorporated its principles into their own training. British Special Air Service units adapted the techniques for operations in Malaya and Borneo. Australian forces used similar methods throughout Southeast Asian conflicts. The knowledge spread across continents and decades. By conservative estimates, tracking doctrine derived from World War II. Native American programs influenced military operations in over 30 countries across 7 decades. Thousands of soldiers received training based on principles first demonstrated in the jungles of New Guinea. The ripple effects of one Apache's observation continued expanding long after the original participants had passed. Civilian applications emerged as well. Search and rescue operations adopted tracking methodologies for finding lost hikers and missing persons. Law enforcement agencies trained officers in terrain analysis for pursuing fugitives through wilderness areas. The Border Patrol developed tracking units that combined traditional skills with modern technology. Today, in the 21st century, military special operations forces still train in techniques that trace directly back to World War II. Navy SEALs learn to read terrain. Army Rangers study deception indicators. The fundamental insight that Whitehorse articulated remains: valid deception reveals what someone wants to hide through the very effort of hiding it. Total impact across 8 decades defies precise calculation. But military historians have attempted estimates. Operations influenced by tracking doctrine contributed to outcomes affecting hundreds of thousands of soldiers across multiple conflicts. Lives saved, missions accomplished, enemies defeated. All connected by an unbroken chain to a cattle rancher who noticed something wrong with a footprint in 1943. But the legacy of James Whitehorse extends beyond military statistics. His story carries lessons that transcend warfare and speak to fundamental truths about innovation, institutions, and human potential. The first lesson concerns the source of good ideas. Military leadership in 1943 did not expect breakthrough tactical insights from a 24-year-old cattle rancher with no formal training. The Army had West Point graduates, intelligence specialists, professional soldiers with decades of experience. Yet none of them could solve the problem that Whitehorse solved within days of arrival. Innovation rarely comes from expected sources. The outsider sees what the insider cannot because the outsider is not blinded by assumptions that define institutional thinking. Whitehorse succeeded precisely because he was not trained in military reconnaissance. He brought different eyes, different knowledge, different frameworks for understanding what he observed. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics, not aeronautical engineers. Penicillin was discovered by a scientist studying something completely different. The internet emerged from military communications research that had nothing to do with social networking or e-commerce. Transformative ideas often come from people working outside established paradigms. The second lesson concerns institutional resistance to change. The Army initially dismissed Whitehorse's theory as insane. Experienced officers who had led multiple failed patrols could not accept that a young Apache might understand something they had missed. Pride training and institutional inertia created barriers that almost prevented a revolutionary insight from being tested. Every organization faces this challenge. Existing methods become embedded in culture. People who have invested careers in current approaches resist alternatives that imply their expertise is incomplete. The bigger the institution, the stronger the resistance. Changing military doctrine required overcoming not just practical objections, but psychological ones rooted in professional identity. The third lesson concerns courage. Whitehorse faced ridicule for his theory. He persisted anyway. He led patrols into dangerous jungle based on observations that experienced soldiers considered meaningless. He risked his life and reputation on wisdom that came from his grandfather rather than military manuals. That required a specific kind of bravery that has nothing to do with combat. The courage to be different. The courage to trust your own perception when authorities disagree. The courage to act on conviction when failure means humiliation. This is the courage that drives all meaningful innovation. Without it, good ideas die in silence, never tested, never proven, never changing anything. These lessons apply far beyond military history. Businesses that cannot hear ideas from unexpected sources fall behind competitors who can. Organizations that punish deviation from established thinking lose their most innovative members. Individuals who lack courage to voice unconventional observations never discover whether those observations might transform their fields. James Whitehorse lived these lessons before anyone articulated them as principles. He simply did what his grandfather taught him. He read the earth. He trusted what he saw. He spoke truth to people who did not want to hear it. And he changed the course of a war. But there is one final detail that almost no one knows. A detail that remained buried in classified files for decades. A detail that adds an unexpected dimension to everything we have discussed. In 1968, a military historian named Dr. Robert Callahan was researching Pacific Theater intelligence operations when he discovered something remarkable in declassified documents. The Japanese had not merely developed counter-tracking techniques. They had specifically studied Native American tracking traditions through pre-war anthropological research conducted in the United States during the 1930s. Colonel Taniguchi, the Japanese intelligence officer who developed trap trails designed to exploit tracker skills, had access to academic papers describing Apache Navajo and Sioux tracking methods. The Japanese had understood what the Americans were using against them because they had studied it years before the war began. This meant something extraordinary. The invisible war between concealment and detection had been more sophisticated than anyone realized. Both sides possessed knowledge of the other's techniques. Both sides adapted continuously. The American advantage came not from surprise, but from evolution. Whitehorse and his fellow trackers learned faster than the Japanese could adapt because they were not following academic papers. They were applying living traditions that could respond to new challenges in real time. The classified reports contained another revelation. Japanese prisoner interrogations after the war revealed that enemy soldiers had developed a term for Native American trackers. They called them ghost readers, men who could see what was not there. men who could hear silence speak. The terminology reflected genuine fear and respect for abilities that seemed almost supernatural to soldiers trained in conventional methods. Colonel Taniguchi himself was interrogated in 1946. His comments about the tracking program were preserved in documents that remained classified until 1998. He stated that the Native American trackers represented the most significant intelligence challenge Japanese forces faced in jungle operations. He believed that if the Americans had deployed such soldiers earlier, and in greater numbers, Pacific campaigns would have concluded months sooner than they did. Coming from an enemy intelligence officer, this assessment carried weight that no American evaluation could match. The Japanese had experienced Whitehorse's impact directly. They understood its significance from the receiving end. James Whitehorse never learned of these documents. He died in 1994 at the age of 75, still living on the Fort Apache reservation, still walking the land his grandfather had taught him to read. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service briefly. It did not mention the Silver Star. It did not mention the tracking program. It did not mention that his observation of a single footprint had influenced military doctrine across 7 decades and contributed to saving thousands of lives. His children knew fragments of the story. His grandchildren knew even less. The full picture remained scattered across classified files, military archives, and memories of fellow veterans who were themselves passing away. But in 2003, Dr. Callahan published a comprehensive history of Pacific Theater intelligence operations. For the first time, the tracking program received detailed public documentation. James Whitehorse was named. His contributions were described. His role in developing techniques that influenced generations of military training was finally acknowledged outside classified circles. The book attracted attention from military historians and Native American communities alike. Here was evidence that traditional indigenous knowledge had proven decisive in modern warfare. Here was proof that wisdom dismissed as primitive had outperformed technology and institutional expertise. Here was a story that deserved to be remembered. Whitehorse's surviving family received copies of the book and supporting documents. His daughter, Mary Whitehorse Chino, read her father's story for the first time with full understanding of what he had accomplished. She wept at passages describing his courage, his insight, and his quiet return to a life that never reflected his extraordinary contributions. She later told an interviewer that her father would have been uncomfortable with the attention. He never sought recognition. He simply did what needed to be done and went home. But she was grateful that the truth was finally known. That future generations would understand what he and his fellow Native American soldiers had accomplished. From a single footprint in New Guinea mud to military doctrine used across 30 countries over 7 decades. From a cattle rancher's observation that 5 trained soldiers missed to techniques that saved thousands of lives in conflicts spanning from World War II to the War on Terror. From a theory dismissed as completely insane to foundational knowledge taught at military academies worldwide. James Whitehorse proved that wisdom comes in many forms. That tradition holds knowledge that technology cannot replicate. That the most powerful observation is sometimes the one that sees what everyone else walks past without noticing. His grandfather taught him that the earth speaks to those who listen. He listened. And what he heard changed history. Approximately 500 to 1,000 American soldiers survived World War II because of operations influenced by the tracking program Whitehorse pioneered. Thousands more across subsequent conflicts benefited from doctrine his insights created. The number continues growing as techniques he helped develop remain in active military use today. That is the power of seeing what others miss. That is the legacy of a quiet Apache who trusted his grandfather's teachings when professional soldiers trusted only their training. If you know stories of other forgotten innovations that changed military history, share them in the comments below. This is just one of hundreds of ideas once called crazy that ended up winning wars. Subscribe to discover more untold stories from history. And remember what James Whitehorse understood before anyone else. Deception is the most honest form of communication. It tells you exactly what someone wants to hide through the very effort of hiding it. Sometimes the most important thing you can learn is how to read what is not there. That is wisdom worth remembering.